In the world of horror movies, it's almost an unwritten rule that if a horror movie is successful, it's going to get a sequel, or 2, or 5. The same isn't exactly true in the world of horror novels, but there are some really great sequels out there, and today I'm going to talk about my top 5 horror novel sequels. Hello book people, I am P.T. Hilton. If you're new here, I talk about horror, fantasy, and crime fiction, and occasionally a little bit about comic books. If that sounds like something you're into, or if you're just the kind of person who likes to talk about books almost as much as you like reading them, you're in the right place. Okay, so let's talk about my top 5 horror sequels. The first one is Spiral by Koji Suzuki. This is the sequel to Ring, the book that the movie The Ring was based upon, as well as its various sequels. I've read, I think, 3 of Koji Suzuki's novels now, and the word I would use to describe them is unsettling. There's just something about the way he writes, the sense of dread that he builds within you, that is just very unnerving. And you got a little bit of a sense of that in the movie, but the books, I feel like this sense is even more powerful. Ring is a really interesting book. I liked it a lot. And Spiral, I liked just as much. It continues the story just, I think, like a day or two after the end of Ring. And it takes an interesting perspective because it kind of follows I think he's a medical professional, a doctor perhaps, who is kind of trying to find like a scientific explanation for the events going on. And, you can guess how that goes. But it does a great job of just building that sense of dread. If you're looking for something kind of unsettling to read, I would recommend it. The other thing I gotta give props to in true horror movie fashion is they still market it, like at least on Amazon, it's still listed as the Ring trilogy, even though there's 5 books in it. So, that's kind of fun. The next one on my list gets a special shout out because it is the only one on the list to just flat out stamp at number 2 in the title, which I highly respect. Again, in true horror movie fashion, they want you to know what it's the sequel to. They're not going to come up with some crazy new title. They're just going to slap a 2 on there, maybe a subtitle, and that's the way it's done in horror, and I like it. This is going to be Clown in a Cornfield 2, Friendo Lives. I really especially respect that too because it's such a great name for a book. The thing I really respected about the first Clown in a Cornfield is that it took the slasher movie and put it in book form like maybe better than any other book I've ever read. It felt like a slasher movie. It felt like we were inside the characters' heads in a way we could only experience in a novel, but it stayed true to that classic slasher stuff while at the same time being very contemporary. And I think the sequel does that just as well, if not perhaps even a little bit better. It's treading on very well-trod territory for horror sequels. It's our final girl is going off to college, which I know we've seen that at least a couple times in horror movies, but it also brings in this very modern thing of like conspiracy theorists and online theories and people trying to disprove things that really happened. So once again, it really captures that slasher stuff while also feeling very modern. If you liked the first one, check it out. If you haven't read the first one, definitely go read both of them. They're just a fun slasher time, and I think they would treat you well in this upcoming spooky season. Number 3 is Legacies by F. Paul Wilson. This is the second book in the Repairman Jack series, which if you haven't checked it out, it's just such a unique series in the world of horror. And it definitely crosses some toes over into the thriller space and also into maybe even the urban fantasy space a little bit. But I think at its heart, it really is a horror series. F. Paul Wilson is a medical doctor. He's written just a ton of novels under various different names throughout the years, starting in the 70s, I think. The first book that Repairman Jack appeared in was in the 80s, and then he wrote the sequel Legacies in the late 90s, and then he wrote like a book a year in this series for quite a long time. If you're not familiar with Repairman Jack, he's kind of a Jack Reacher almost-ish type character, I would say, like a tough guy, but what he's dealing with is more horror type stuff. He's a fixer, you can call him, with any problem, and those problems often tend to be supernatural in origin. I guess there's a little bit of Dresden Files in there too, but I would say this leans definitely more towards horror. There's definitely some almost eldritch horror kind of stuff going on in this series. The series is a little bit confusing to know the reading order of because Repairman Jack also appears in this other series by F. Paul Wilson, The Adversary Cycle, which kind of brings together multiple protagonists from his different series. And depending on what site you're on, it'll like list them in a different order. But the standard numbering, at least right now, is that Legacies is the second one. It's kind of weird putting Legacies on this list, and I might get a little pushback because it's one of the few Repairman Jack stories that doesn't really have any supernatural elements. It's more of just human beings. But the human beings, what they're doing is pretty horrific, and maybe it leans a little bit more towards thriller than some of the other Repairman Jack series books. But that is something I like about the series. You never know going in what you're going to get. Is this going to be a a supernatural thing? Is he going to be dealing with some crazy eldritch horror? Is he going to be dealing with just some bad guys? You don't know, and this is just a fun series. It's very different than anything else out there. Even though it pulls tropes from multiple genres, it's just a different reading experience. I like Repairman Jack a lot. Check it out if you have not done so already. All right, we're going to get to my top two. Any guesses as to what they are? While you're thinking about that, in the meantime, if you enjoy this type of content, click subscribe so you don't miss any videos going forward. All right, number two, you might have guessed that this would be on the list, and that is Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, the long-awaited sequel to The Shining. I feel like when this first came out, there was maybe some like so-so and negative reactions to it just because of the weight of The Shining has as a horror classic. But what King did so well here is he didn't let that weight bring him down. He wasn't holding anything back to try to like appease the rabid fans of The Shining. He was taking this where he wanted to take it, and he took it in a very interesting place. I think where we find Dan Torrance as an adult is really unexpected, at least it was to me, and interesting. And the villains are very creepy, and the way that it all kind of ties together into the Shining universe is also really well done. I also am a huge fan of the movie, the Mike Flanagan directed Dr. Sleep. It was pretty amazing to me how he was able to pay homage to both the book version of The Shining and the movie version of The Shining, and somehow kind of meld those together in a way that really worked well in a movie. Before we get to number one thing that you might have thought you'd see on this list that you're not seeing is the second book in the Indian Lake trilogy by Stephen Graham Jones. I know it's a popular series. I've not read it yet, though. I'm planning to read it in advance of the third one coming out next March. So maybe when I do read it, maybe my list will change a little bit. But let's get to my number one, which in my opinion is the indisputed number one best horror sequel of all time, and that is Silence of the Lambs, the sequel to Red Dragon, the first book that kind of introduced us to Hannibal Lecter and Will Graham and this whole world. Silence of the Lambs, I mean, come on, it's classic. What am I going to say? I had a writing teacher who would always refer to Silence of the Lambs as the perfect novel. He was like almost obsessed with it as far as like chapter length. He was like, these are the perfect length chapters. This is what you want to aim for in a page turner book. And you know, it's hard to disagree. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing read. If you have only seen the movie, the truly amazing movie, check out the book as well. Again, some people might categorize this more as a thriller, but I think Hannibal Lecter kind of makes a lot of the lists of the top horror villains of all time, and there's a good reason for that. I think this while it might toe the line into thriller, and it's the way it's structured might be thriller-ish, I think there's enough horror elements there for me to categorize this as my number one horror sequel of all time. But that's just my list. I'm curious to see what you think. Put your favorites in the comment. Guys, at the risk of being a little Harvey Dent about this whole thing with the number two in mind, I also did a video on my favorite pairings of authors and narrators. I'll put that right over here. Check it out, and we will talk to you next time.